You're all very welcome here today at today's seminar, and this is the 7th in the Knowledge Exchange seminar series, which is jointly sponsored by Queen's University and the Assembly's Research and Information Service. The purpose of these seminars is to encourage engagement with local research findings and to promote evidence-based policy and lawmaking in Northern Ireland. And I'm delighted to say that Mickey Brady, MLA, from the Assembly's Committee for Health and Social Services and Public Safety, has kindly joined us to provide some opening comments before we hear today's presentation from Karen McElrath and Julie Harris from the School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work at Queen's. We got that right. And their presentation is entitled Institutional Stigma and the Delivery of Methadone Maintenance, a comparison of clients' experiences from North and South Ireland. So just finally, before we begin, please could I just ask you to turn off any mobile phones, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Mickey Brady.
Thanks very much. I think if we could just start initially by apologising for Sue Ramsey and Jim Wells, Chair and Vice Chair of the committee. So I've kind of been drafted in as a, I said to somebody earlier, not a super sub, just a sub. And I would apologise because I have to leave early. I've a meeting pre-arranged in Uri in the constituency. So after the introduction I'll leave, so don't take it personally. And I will read the literature, and I'm sure the Research and Information Service will keep up the high standards of briefings that we get certainly in the committee and find extremely useful and informative. So I'd start by saying that in my capacity as a member of the Health, Social Services and Public Safety Committee, I welcome this opportunity to open today's seminar about institutional stigma and the delivery of methadone maintenance. The seminar is of interest to the committee, particularly given that drug misuse is a significant public health issue in the North, and addiction to heroin and other opioids poses serious problems for individuals, their families and the wider community. And I was just talking to Karen and Leslie Ann earlier. Sometimes there's a misconception. I think that heroin addiction and abuse is a relatively modern phenomenon. I went to school in Uri in the 60s, and in the mid-60s to late 60s, when I was doing A-levels in lower sixth, there was a guy behind me, a year behind me at school, who, him and a couple of others, indulged in glue sniffing. Sort of started off then, they presumably moved on, and there was a lot of LSD around in Uri at that time. I think there was a manufacturing outlet somewhere around Banbridge. There was quite a lot of people into that, and there was all sorts of different kind of drugs starting to come through. He, I think, then graduated, if that's the right word, onto marijuana, etc. But the last I heard of him about, and I had lost contact, very talented lad, came from a very well-off family, more so than most in Uri at that particular time. He went to London then, and the last I heard, he had become a registered heroin addict and died in the early 70s, when he was probably only around 30. Probably less, late 20s. So it maybe highlights to me that there was a problem then, and it's a growing and continuing problem. And you know, one of the most detrimental long-term effects of heroin is the addiction itself and the physical dependence on it. In the North, there are around 300 registered addicts, most of whom are heroin users. And again, in my previous life, working in an advice centre in Uri as a welfare rights worker, I did come across some people who had been to London and were registered heroin addicts, and had come back. Most of them had a string of convictions to try and feed their habit, and it is a sad reflection on how it affects people. And in talking about the 300 registered addicts, the figure is probably not a true reflection of the extent of opioid dependence, often because people are reluctant to come forward for treatment. And plans to respond to the drug problem here in the North were first developed in 1999, and since then a number of initiatives have been established. For those addicted to opioids, methadone maintenance treatment is one possible way to help reduce addiction levels. Although this form of treatment can yield positive results, many clients leave the treatment programme in its early stages. Today's seminar is about clients' experiences with MMT programmes, both here in the North and the Republic. It provides findings of 4 different studies in both jurisdictions, which hopefully will help inform the challenges faced when developing policy and law in this area and when delivering services in this area, because it has seemed to me, and certainly to members of the committee, that there has been a void and a vacuum in this particular area. So this leads me on to introduce Karen McElrath and Julie Harris from Queen's, and wish you the best of luck in your afternoon, and again apologies for having to leave. And thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Karen, and this is Julie. Julie is a PhD student in our department, and she's completing a PhD this year. I was her supervisor. And we want to talk to you about client experiences with methadone maintenance in particular, and from a north-south comparison. And there may be, I'm assuming that there might be different levels of knowledge about methadone among the audience. And so I want to just take 3 or 4 minutes to give you some background on methadone. So just bear with me if you're already familiar with this. I want to take you back first to the 1960s. In New York City, Rockefeller Institute, there was a team of medical researchers there. One of them was Vincent Dole, who was an expert in metabolic disease. Another was Marie Neiswander, who was an expert in psychiatry. And then there was a third person who's not well known because she wasn't attached to any of the original papers. Her name was Mary Jean Creek. And they were working in an inpatient unit. And on the inpatient unit, there were a number of people who were dependent on opioids, namely heroin. And they were very interested in finding a way to help these people withdraw from heroin, to ease the withdrawal symptoms, and to reduce the cravings for heroin. So they were giving them morphine injections. And they were finding out rather quickly that the morphine injections worked. Yes, people's withdrawal symptoms from heroin, which can be quite agonizing, they tended to be minimized, and the cravings tended to be reduced a wee bit, but the morphine injections had to be administered 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day. And within a week of coming onto the treatment, the morphine dosage level would have had to been increased. Okay, so morphine really wasn't an effective treatment overall. So this team of researchers searched the medical literature. And this was prior to the internet, so you can imagine that this would have been somewhat difficult to do, and they sort of stumbled on methadone. Methadone, there were a few reports in the medical literature in the 1960s about methadone. They realized that it was synthesized first by German chemists in the 1940s. It had been around for 20, 25 years. It was a synthetic opioid, and they thought it might do the trick. It was much more time-consuming and complicated than that, but that's pretty much a synopsis. So they introduced methadone to the patients, and they noticed relatively quickly that people started, I hate to use the word functioning, but I will. They started functioning very well, okay, within, say, a week, 10 days. There was an artist among the patients, for example, and the artist wanted to return to art, something that he had totally lost interest in during the years that he was dependent on heroin. And they noticed that a number of other people wanted to return to work, or they were interested in pursuing some kind of educational or vocational training or whatever. They were interested in life. And that, to them, was very encouraging. And so, to them, why methadone? Well, methadone seemed to help stabilize people. Okay? It helped reduce the withdrawal symptoms and the cravings that were associated with heroin use. And methadone was longer acting than morphine. They were, as opposed to the multiple injections of morphine a day, methadone required an oral dose, okay? And it was 1 dose per day, as long as that dose was high enough. And methadone was relatively inexpensive, okay? So all of these were advantages in terms of methadone as an intervention. These are the 3 that I mentioned earlier. This team of researchers also introduced the concept of methadone maintenance, which to them was the prescribed daily use of methadone over the long term. But they learned very quickly that methadone, as a pharmacological intervention, was not going to do it alone. They had to combine methadone with something else. And to them, a lot of the something else were these psychosocial interventions, okay? Things like counseling, group counseling. They thought some people responded very well to group counseling. Others did not. They responded to one-on-one counseling. Some people, they argued, didn't need counseling at all, but they may have needed assistance with the likes of housing or vocational training, educational training, etc. And the researchers felt very strongly, again, that the pharmacological benefits of methadone were limited unless individuals could go through what they called the social rehabilitation that would help them address their social, personal, and sometimes health problems as well. The team of researchers was very innovative and progressive in terms of how they envisioned the treatment setting should be. And they were very convinced that the treatment setting had to be characterized by trust and rapport between the staff and the patients. So they actually hired, and again, this goes back 50 years, they hired former patients of the unit, okay? Many of whom were still on methadone. They were in recovery, okay? They hired them to come back and work as liaison staff between the treatment providers and the patients. And they weren't just patient advocates. They also intervened with or contacted, for example, the treatment staff. And when treatment staff had problems or concerns with a group of patients, these individuals, former patients, would go back to their clients to help sort it. After the 1960s, we see an expansion of methadone maintenance treatment in the United States, particularly in cities on the East Coast. There were a number in New York, for example. But within 10 years of Dole and Niswander, of their reports being published, we see a big change in the way that methadone maintenance is delivered in the United States. All of a sudden, there's a number of rules and regulations that are quite stringent and very much focused on the client behavior. Okay? And this was not in the original vision of Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander. From the 1980s to the present, we see aspects of this US model, the aspects being a very regulatory model, okay, a very stringent model, sometimes stigmatizing model. We see aspects of that model being sort of transported to and adopted within other countries that were interested in implementing methadone maintenance. What does the international research tell us about the effectiveness of methadone maintenance? It tends to focus on these four things, and there's been hundreds of studies on the effectiveness of methadone maintenance, and we could probably stack those studies from the floor to the, not that ceiling, but some ceilings. And in general, the studies tend to show that methadone maintenance tends to reduce heroin use, tends to reduce fatal overdoses involving heroin, tends to reduce risk behaviors associated with Hep C and HIV, and tends to reduce criminality. Okay, so that's, in general, what the patterns of the international research tend to show us. But if you look at those studies in more detail, there's a big problem with those studies, a number of them. And the problem is that several methadone clients leave treatment within a few days or a week or so or a few months after signing up to it. Okay? And upwards of 40 to 60%, this is sort of the international evidence, okay? 40 to 60%, which is roughly half of methadone clients leave treatment within a year, prematurely. So that's a big problem with those studies. So in other words, these studies are based on biased samples, okay, that are tipped in favor of positive outcomes, all right, because so many people have left treatment. There's a number of reasons why people leave treatment. They leave for individual factors, okay? It's just not a good time in their life to engage with treatment. But they also leave because of program factors. There's a mismatch between them and the program. They don't like the program, they think it's too rigid, too stigmatizing, whatever. But it's important that we engage people with treatment as long as possible, because methadone treatment, just like other forms of treatment, works best when people can engage with treatment for longer periods of time. Some of you are familiar with the whole lead-up into substitute prescribing in Northern Ireland. Methadone maintenance has been available officially since 2004, relatively late compared to Western European countries. But on the other hand, this place, in my opinion, went through a lot of change in a 3-year period. We had needle exchanges that were implemented in 2001. We had a drug outreach team, which was based in Belfast, implemented between 2001 and 2004. Can't remember the precise year. And a big change with regards to the availability of methadone and Subutex prescribing. So big changes within a very relatively brief period of time. This is a census date. This is the latest data that we had available to us, 31st of March 2010. On that day, there were 466 people in Northern Ireland in receipt of prescribed methadone or Subutex, of whom 52% were on methadone maintenance, which is roughly around 240 people. The south of Ireland, quite different in terms of numbers. Methadone maintenance has been available since '92. On this census date, the 1st of August, on that day, there were roughly 9,200 people in receipt of methadone maintenance. There's differences and similarities in terms of the patterns of heroin use between those two. I won't get into it in this presentation, but I will just say that the patterns of diffusion have been very similar. And by diffusion, we mean in Northern Ireland in the late 1990s, for example, heroin was pretty much focused. I know the Newry example, and there certainly are other examples like that Mickey gave. But in the late 90s, it was pretty much confined to the 3 Bs, Ballymena, Bangor, and parts of Belfast. Okay, and by the early 2000s, it was starting to spread, and now we see heroin use and heroin dependence among people in rural areas, villages, towns, all across Northern Ireland. So it's diffused out of the 3B areas. And the same thing happened in Dublin. Dublin heroin use, as you may be aware, was pretty much confined to the Dublin city area. And in the late 90s, it started to diffuse to different counties, including some of the most remote counties in the south of Ireland. Supervised consumption is the norm in both these jurisdictions, which means that people have to go into a chemist or a pharmacy, and drink their methadone in the presence of pharmacy staff. That would be the norm. There are some take-home doses permitted, but for the most part, people have to comply with supervised consumption, and this would be on a daily basis, bar Sunday. How did we conduct this study? This research that Julie and I did, it's a little bit different because we combined 4 different studies of which we had been involved, not together, okay, but we had worked on these studies separately. And these studies had some things in common. The studies all used face-to-face interviews to collect data from people who were dependent on heroin. And so all the studies included people who were using heroin. I shouldn't have actually put the word dependent in there, but who were using heroin at the time of the study, 81 of whom had direct experience with methadone maintenance. So there were 81 people across the 4 studies. And 2 of the studies were conducted in the north, 2 others took place in the south, and those would have been in Counties Louth, which would have been Dundalk, and Dublin, County Dublin, but it was actually North County Dublin, between Balbriggan and Swords area. Okay? So a lot of those individuals would have been people from upper income backgrounds. Data from the 4 studies were collected between 2004 and 2010. And today we want to talk about these 3 main findings. And after we show you this slide, we want to share with you some interviewee quotes that sort of illustrate the findings. So one of the main findings is that methadone clients across all 4 studies many times feel like they are viewed as addicts, regardless of the stage of recovery. And they feel that other people, service providers, okay, look at them as addicts and assume that they're going to be engaging in stereotypical addict-like behavior, such as stealing. Okay? A second main finding was that methadone clients often feel like they are undeserving customers, and this finding relates to pharmacy settings in particular. Not all pharmacies, okay, but a number of the pharmacies. They feel like undeserving customers, primarily because of the lack of privacy in pharmacies, okay, which causes embarrassment for them, and also because of what Julie and I call the wait that they undergo in pharmacies because they're collecting their methadone, as opposed to things that other regular or normal customers are engaging in within the pharmacy setting. And the final main finding is that a number of the clients that we interviewed feel like passive recipients of treatment. And what we mean by this is they feel like they don't have much of a say in treatment decisions that directly affect them. So it's kind of awkward, I suppose, to show quotes in a PowerPoint presentation, but so I'll have you read the quote, and then to be really condescending, I'm going to read the quote, just in case somebody can't see it, okay? So this quote is an illustration of the addict identity that clients feel that other people perceive them to be, okay? One time I was buying toothpaste-like. She thought I was trying to steal it. Why would I steal toothpaste? And if somebody was stealing toothpaste, why would they steal it from the chemist where they get their methadone? I know it's hard on the chemist too. Maybe they get ripped off sometimes. But see, being treated like that, everyone needs to go through that to see what it's like. Loads of pharmacists in town told meth clients that they can't bring friends with them into the pharmacy. You can't bring friends unless they are buying something. What about other people picking up prescriptions for drugs? How come they can bring their friends? So there was a distrust, okay? And some pharmacies set up rules and regulations with regards to how many people the methadone client could enter the pharmacy with. That was primarily in the south of Ireland, okay? Again, this gets to the addict identity that a number of methadone clients feel. It doesn't take a genius to know why you're in there. You had to sit in a chair. She had to call my name before I could go to the counter. You'd swear I had leprosy. And you couldn't go in the pharmacy if someone else was in there getting their methadone. There was like a screen and you could see the top of their head. I'd wait outside till they finished. So the interviewee, a male in this instance, says, I think they just need to treat people better from the start. They look at us like dogs, as if we are robbing and all. You see that paper they give us when we start. We're not supposed to even look around the room. And the interviewer says, what room? The whole pharmacy. And the individual says, yeah, we're just supposed to look straight ahead, not look around at all. And we have to sit there. So this gets to the notion of contracts, which are operating in the north, or were about 18 months ago at least, when Julie and I took a look at an example of one from Northern Ireland, and they also are operating in the south. Okay, so there's a contract, a list of behaviors, client-based behaviors.
I think that there are a variety of different ones which...
Do you think there's...
Well, we have what's called an agreement. It has it's broken down into 4 different sections, and it's what's expected from the client treatment, and then what they can expect from their doctor, treatment, and the pharmacist in terms of, the treatment, courtesy, respect. So it actually details who will do what. But I have seen contracts which are who will, you will, you will, you will.
Yeah, so there's different ones, right.
So I'm aware of it.
Yeah, so there's different ones, Des. And different, even in Northern Ireland, there's different, okay.
And also what you'll find is that we have what's called a 4-way agreement.
Right.
Beyond that, you can then find that even though we've got a 4-way agreement signed up, is that the pharmacist then can produce their own.
Yes.
This is my list of what you should do
Yes.
in pharmacy.
Yeah,
Now
I know.
That's kind of outside of
I know.
treatment provider.
And there's definitely good pharmacies as well. I mean, clients told us this over and over again. And the information about good pharmacies circulates so quickly among methadone clients. And that kind of information about good and bad pharmacies also reaches people who are dependent on heroin and who have never engaged with treatment. And sometimes we believe that deters them from engaging with treatment at all, because they hear these stories that sort of circulate through the client folk, it's client folklore, or it's actually truth in some cases probably. But it's interesting, your point about the contracts, that there may be different contracts and the pharmacist can implement additional rules and regulations. The one we looked at, Des, may have been, well, maybe we shouldn't say, but there's only 3 trusts left. But anyway, the one we looked at was signed by the client, the prescriber, the dispenser, and the key worker, but the behaviors in the contract applied only to the client, the methadone client. And I know it would be difficult to say to a doctor, okay, if you miss 3 appointments, we are scrapping you from the methadone program. You're not going to be allowed to, but clients take this on board, and they see that the contract deals, or at least this contract, right, deals largely with their behaviors. This is the lack of privacy in pharmacies. You can go in there, but you have to make a point. You can go in there, you can ask to go in there, a separate and a private room, but you have to make a point of it. I ask for privacy as there's members of my old work and others present. There's always people standing there, and I get really embarrassed. Now, the embarrassment factor, not everyone felt embarrassed. Some people were very comfortable being known as methadone clients within their own communities where they grew up, okay? But the embarrassment factor certainly was mentioned in a number of interviews across the 4 studies, and people handled the embarrassment differently. Some people, when they went in, because they had to visit the pharmacy nearly every day, okay, so they were going in every day. Some people, to handle the embarrassment factor, would shop around and pretend to be a normal customer, okay, pretend that they were going to buy something, which may have spooked the pharmacist or the pharmacy staff into thinking that they were actually going to steal something. That's a possibility. Okay, other people would wait outside till other normal customers were done with their business in the pharmacy. They would wait outside and then go in because they were very embarrassed. So I had asked, this was an interview that I was doing, and I had asked the individual about what kind of setup was in the pharmacy, where they were getting their methadone within the pharmacy, what it was like. And I asked him about, was it private? And he said, private, it's not really that private. They walk out with a cup, and plenty of time, there's some people in there, especially at lunch hour. Walks out with a cup and says, come on, so-and-so. And I go into the room, not really a room, that's where they take the photos, and everyone knows what's in the cup. This is what Julie and I called the wait, which was disturbing or bothered a lot of clients that we interviewed. You can probably tell by some of this language that this person comes from the north. The 2-head bit is a dead giveaway, is it not? Sometimes I have to wait half an hour to get my meth. She has to serve everyone first, even people who come in after me. I'm waiting there and people looking at me like I've got 2 heads. She's getting paid for helping us, but you feel like you have to kiss her toes. Now, what might be happening here as well is that some pharmacists may be keenly aware that some people are embarrassed. Okay, and due to lack of space or space restrictions in pharmacies, there may be pharmacists who prefer to serve everybody because they want to limit the embarrassment factor for the client. That's a possibility. Okay, but clients aren't perceiving that. So an easy way to resolve that would be just to explain to the client, or give the client the power to make the decision. Hey, do you mind if I, serve you methadone if your Aunt Betty's down there, or somebody else? Or would you rather I serve everybody else and then you can have more privacy? So some of the problems that people had with the wait were very tied in with the lack of privacy that they also felt. And in Julie's study was largely Belfast-based, okay? She didn't notice so much of the embarrassment factor when they went into pharmacies, because Belfast is a city just like for us, it's anonymizing, and we can get away with more, And this individual was from a small village outside Ballymena. And so the embarrassment factor was probably more apparent for people who lived in small towns and villages. But in saying that, I'm not suggesting, and Julie isn't either, that, we move the pharmacies out of towns and villages, because people at one time, and perhaps still, some people travel 15, 20 miles a day to collect their methadone. And many of them would prefer to access the methadone in their own town. But so that's a problem that is not easily solved. This gets to clients feeling like they have no input into treatment decisions that affect them. There's a dosage that is given when people start methadone. I'm not even sure what it is. Is it about 30 milligrams? 30 mils, yeah? Some of you may know that. When they first start, and they start very small, and they build people up to higher doses that, that meet the stabilization requirement for that individual. But they generally start low because people, we don't want to overdose. Okay, we don't want clients to overdose on methadone, so they start low. And clients tended to reject that one-size-fits-all. Okay, that was never precisely explained to them as to why people are getting this small dose to begin with. But we found very few concerns about current dosage levels, which seems to come up in the literature a lot. In the literature, you will find that clients typically complain about current dosage levels, which they argue are too small, too low. And we didn't find that with the clients in Julie's sample or the other 3 studies. But we did find that dosages were sometimes perceived as punishment or used as punishment. And this, we actually mentioned that it was from the Republic because it's quite alarming. This was a chemist in Dundalk. Some chemists in town, if you're late, they'll pour the methadone down the sink. Pour it down, I swear. There's you using heroin again. So that's a matter of somebody late, maybe consistently late. I don't know. But the client reported that the chemist would pour the methadone down the sink. And this is concerns over progress. Okay, these quotes are from two different people. The first one, I'm afraid of methadone. The years are flying by and I'm still on it. They won't let me come down. And the second person, I think of all the people who have used heroin, loads of them, and I only know a few people who got off it. I know people who've been on methadone for years, and that scares me. There were times during interviews when people asked us as researchers if we knew people who had been on methadone and got off methadone and were no longer using heroin either. So we were asked for examples of people who we might have come across, and obviously we're not professionals who are engaged in that work, but we would be researchers. That's a real issue for people. People want to see, clients want to see others who have come off methadone maintenance and are no longer using heroin. And they exist. They exist. This person said methadone's a cure, but methadone isn't a long-term cure. Methadone is there to cure you in the short term, but they're doing it wrong here. They're putting people on methadone for years and years and years. If you go to them and say, could you put my methadone up? They say to you, you don't need to go up. But see if you go in and say to them, could you start to take me down off my methadone? They turn around and tell you that you need to go up. So these are some examples of what we mean by clients' concerns, some clients' concerns about progress, about their treatment progress. A number of them just envisioned that they would be on methadone maintenance for years, and this was disturbing to them, which is something that I never really thought about, actually, as a researcher. I thought that long-term methadone, methadone for life was distinctly possible and probably a good thing. And then to come across clients when we asked about it, that really don't want this. A number of them don't. So the main conclusions, attitudes by some service providers, to us derive from stereotypical assumptions that are tied to people who are dependent on heroin. And society is full of these stereotypical assumptions about people who use heroin, and we know about these assumptions. But what happens when we have these assumptions, and I have them as well, is that when we're trying to deliver a treatment that is comprised of rules and regulations that focus more on controlling addict behavior than anything else, then these stereotypical assumptions are reinforced by the service providers. Their stereotypical assumptions are reinforced because the rules and regulations are telling them that, yes, addicts are not to be trusted. Sorry about that, got carried away. Oh dear. Will you turn that TV off for a minute, please? Okay, so we suggest that the stereotypical assumptions that characterize some of the rules and regulations around methadone and are held by some service providers, we suggest that these reflect institutional stigma, okay? Reflect institutional stigma. And the problem with institutional stigma is that it can disempower clients. It can disempower methadone clients. And the problem with that is that recovery, for people to recover from addiction, from any addiction, they need to feel empowered. So this is the main problem with the institutional stigma that we feel that the data suggest. What might be done? Some ideas. We've seen this in the literature. Some people are arguing that methadone maintenance provision needs to look at clients as customers or consumers, as opposed to clients. Okay? Another idea would be to establish advisory groups of service users who can contribute to the development of anti-stigma interventions. Now, the advisory groups of service users, there's quite a good bit of information that is emerging about service users, the benefits of the role that service users can play in treatment delivery. There's a number of challenges to working with service users at that level as well, okay? But that's another idea that has been tried in a few places with some degree of success. But again, there's challenges that need to be addressed, probably creatively. Another idea is this idea of patient-focused advocates that Dolan Neiswander tried in the 1960s. Another idea, which probably is the most difficult, encourage clients to develop non-addict identities. Alter the institutional identity of addiction services. Why do we call them that? Why do we call them addiction services? Should we call them recovery centers? This individual, William White, I don't know if any of you have seen this document. It's sort of floated around various internet sites, and it's become quite popular. It's really a policy document on what can we do to make methadone better. And he's in Philadelphia. If anybody wants the link, I'm happy to send it to him, because this was his idea. Why are we calling them addiction centers? We need to call them recovery centers. It's much more positive, okay, and not as stigmatizing. Just an idea. Implement ways to encourage service users to have a stake in program ownership. This is sort of related to two of the ideas on the previous slide. And the last one involved like-minded, empowered others in the treatment process. So we mentioned when we were talking about the fact that clients feel like they don't have a stake in treatment decisions. And it's important for them to see people who are no longer involved in methadone maintenance but are no longer using heroin as well. And it's those people that could somehow be integrated into a treatment program that would really do wonders for the client. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, I know 3 of those individuals, one who is no longer on a Subutex program, and 2 who are no longer using or on a methadone maintenance program. And the 3 of them are not using heroin. That's just 3 that I know. I'm sure some people in this audience will know a half dozen, maybe a dozen, or something, you know, and it would not take long to figure out who these individuals are, because they can do wonders in a treatment program for people just to see them and engage with them. And that's about it. Thank you very much. Thank you.